Everyone's ready. I'm very excited. I think this is going to be very enriching for all of us. Okay, some of it Gustavo might have seen, but there are actually some very new ones. This is from our class. Okay, so let's begin. Professor Ellis, is this okay? Do you see the?
Yes, it looks very nice.
Okay, so I will now mute myself and then you can take over.
Well, thank you for inviting me for this second Zoom meeting, and it's good to meet all of you via Zoom. Maybe one day in person, like I've met Gustavo and Professor Coy. And Professor Coy told me that it was very unique for you to meet a Jew even via Zoom. And I think it's important because, for a variety of reasons, because starting with the fact that you think of Jews mostly in what you call the Old Testament. But Jews don't call it the Old Testament. We call it the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. It's the First Testament. And it is old, but the New Testament is old too. So we could call this the Older Testament, and we could call the New Testament the Old Testament. But my point for this is to show you that Jews are alive. We still exist, and we have existed throughout time. And many of the people that I've met where I taught for many years from around the world were taught by missionaries that Jews disappeared when Jesus came. And the way Christianity usually interprets Jews is that they set the table, as it were, and now you have a new covenant and Jews are no longer, or denied the new covenant, or should be punished for that, and I've run into that around the world. So I wanted to share on a more positive level that Jews exist and as real people, and our covenant continues. And I will do this partly through my own story, which isn't only my own, it is my own, but it illustrates parts of contemporary Jewish life, at least in the United States, and there are other contemporary Jews around the world, including in Israel, but beyond Israel too. So that's where I'll start. I'll start with my childhood, where I began to find my voice. And here is my childhood home in North Miami Beach, Florida, with my father, and then with me and my brother, and then my mother, and my sister and myself, lower middle class Jews. My father had served in the army during World War II, went to Europe, fought with the Allies against the Nazis. My mother was a school teacher, and we grew up thinking that everyone was Jewish because we lived in a Jewish neighborhood, and began to find that there were a lot of people around that weren't Jewish, and had to ask the question, who were they? So in my childhood, I really didn't know anything about Christianity at all. We lived a completely Jewish life. And very ordinary. You think of Jews in a very prayerful way, or in discussions about Jesus, whatever, but actually, I spent most of my childhood playing baseball and football and basketball, and was quite good and loved it. Still love baseball and football and basketball. So as a child, I knew I was Jewish, but I was living in America. And I had an ordinary childhood, just like you would have in your ordinary life growing up. And I went to Hebrew school, as most Jews did at the time, starting at 5 or 6 years old. Much as you attended Sunday school, but our Hebrew school was on Sunday, but also on Tuesday and Thursday, or Monday and Wednesday after public school, because in public school, we learned about America, but we didn't really learn about Jews. And so we were mixed with everyone during the day in public school. And then we gathered as Jews together. We had a modern education in public school, and we learned about ancient rites and rituals and life and the continuity of a people, the Jewish people, well after Jesus and well after the foundation of Christianity. We had our own life and our own schools and our own religious services. And there I'm wearing a tallis, and that's my bar mitzvah photo. And so when I was 13, I became a son of the covenant, and I recited texts before the congregation, and I wore a tallis, and that was before my bar mitzvah picture, which you can see I'm looking very serious there. And then my mother told me to lighten up, I think, and this is the one that my family likes the best, coming up. So I had the serious, which is the way I am, although I do smile too. And then I have the smile. And that's when I was 13 years old. And boys become bar mitzvah at 13, but also girls with a bat mitzvah now in many parts of the Jewish life. It's a rite of passage, maybe like confirmation or in Catholic circles. But my path towards spirituality wasn't only Jewish. Now there's Bob Dylan in the sunglasses, and I wish to own sunglasses like that someday. And some of you may know of Bob Dylan, some of his famous songs, Blowing in the Wind, and very progressive and radical Jewish. But when he sings, you wouldn't know he was Jewish necessarily. He often sings in a very universal language, which was quite Jewish, and very deep lyrics about life and death, about poverty and justice and injustice and war. So a very important influence in my life. And he also had a bar mitzvah. And I know friends of mine who were at his bar mitzvah, which was quite a claim to fame. And my claim to fame with Bob Dylan is that he read my first book and sent me an autographed picture signed by Bob Dylan to me. There it is, my shroud. It's to Mark, best wishes, Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize recently, a tremendous influence around the world and very Jewish, and quite grateful to live in the time that he lived. And of course, the Beatles, who are not Jewish, but very influential in my spirituality and in many others. And on the bottom there is Leonard Cohen, who is Jewish, a great poet and singer too. And my point about bringing these singers up is that much of our spirituality actually doesn't come from synagogue or church. It comes from popular culture. And often we have this division between popular culture with depth and religion. But I think it's more complicated that we live a life and then we go to church or synagogue. But I have a more holistic sense, and Bob Dylan, and in some ways the Beatles and Leonard Cohen were as important to me, and sometimes more, than what I learned in synagogue, in Jewish religious teaching, as a youth especially. and the Kennedys. Many of you probably don't know about the Kennedys, but John F. Kennedy was elected president in the United States in 1960, and his brother, Robert, they were both gunned down, Kennedy in 63, John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy in 68, both Irish Catholics, or Irish background Catholics, US citizens, who were very much for inclusion and justice. And many Jews were attracted to them, not because they were Jewish, which they weren't, but because of their broad message of world peace and harmony and justice, and especially the inclusion of African Americans and other minorities in the United States. Very, very important in my spirituality, in a sense, for justice in the public realm. Well, there I am. I've got my long hair again because of the pandemic, but there I am at, well, maybe 20 years old, heading to Europe. I was a student, and that's my international student card. And I traveled to London to study for 6 months. But before that, I went around Europe to Italy and France and Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, which was difficult because during the 1930s and 40s, when my father was in the army, the Nazis ruled Germany and ruled parts of Europe. And there were many Jews in Europe. In fact, Jews were centered in Europe in many ways, the Jewish population. And they were greatly discriminated against and then murdered by the millions in what we call the Holocaust. So going to Europe for me was quite a trip culturally to learn from museums and to explore other nations, but also historically because I was born just 7 years after the Holocaust was over and very much ultimately formed by that experience of Jews in Europe, because Europe was just about emptied of Jews. Many came to the United States, and that was me and traveling around Europe. And also I went to the Soviet Union at that time and spent a month in Israel, and was my first experience of Israel. It was 1973, and I was actually there during the start of the Yom Kippur War, where Israel fought with the Arab nations. And I was flown out of there on the 3rd or 4th day of that war. So it was a tremendous experience. And it was my first time of seeing what had happened after the Holocaust. Many Jews went to Palestine and created the state of Israel, in which most Jews were very proud of. But it was also my first experience, although at a distance, with the Arabs of Palestine, or Palestinians as we call them now. And that was to be formative in my life too, bouncing the suffering of Jews in Europe, the Holocaust, the creation of the state of Israel, and then the dislocation and oppression of the Palestinian people by Israeli Jews, some of whom had suffered in the Holocaust. And this was my teacher at that time at Florida State University in the north of Florida, Richard Rubenstein, who had written a groundbreaking book after Auschwitz. It was the beginning of what we call Holocaust theology, and it raised questions, serious questions, deep questions, dark questions about God. What could we say about God that allowed, didn't do anything about, couldn't do anything about the mass murder of 6 million Jews? Because although Christians thought that the covenant with the Jewish people had been abrogated by Jesus and Christianity, Jews didn't think that. We have our own covenant, which is now recognized by the Catholic Church as valid, even from a Catholic perspective. And Rubinstein raised the question, had the covenant been broken? The covenant is in a sense a contract between God and the people. God says, you are my people. I will lay down laws and ways of living which you must obey. And the people contract with God, and God has certain responsibilities too, like protecting the people and being with Jews. And the question in the Holocaust, in the death camps and the mass murder of Jews, Rubinstein asked, where was God? And he believed that the covenant had been broken, not by Christianity, but by the fact that God, who had promised to be with Jews, was absent during the Holocaust. I was very young, and to hear this discussion was very disturbing, but also enlightening. It made God more difficult for me, but also more present ultimately. It was so reading his book after Auschwitz, which was published in 1966, and reading it in the early 1970s with him was a formative experience for me. And the Holocaust became central to my understanding of what it means to be Jewish, but also our obligations to others. When I finished at my university, I was accepted to several prestigious universities for graduate studies, but I had met Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement, through another teacher I had who had written a biography of Dorothy Day. And I was intrigued not by her Catholicism, although it was a Catholic movement of justice and peace, practiced nonviolence and living with the poor. I was intrigued by a different path than Rubinstein, my teacher, my other teacher, had sensed. And he had said, history is a cycle of violence and atrocity without end. You either have power or you're going to be stomped on. And his view was Jews needed power, and I understood that and still understand that. But the Catholic worker presented a different kind of understanding of being with those outside of society, on the margins of society, living with the poor and feeding the poor. And I decided, instead of going to this prestigious university, to go up to New York City and live and work in the Catholic Worker House of Hospitality, where Dorothy Day lived and others. And I wrote a diary there, which became my first book, titled A Year at the Catholic Worker, which is the book that Bob Dylan read. So that was quite something. And it was a very difficult year for me, my diaries. And my new book, I Am Who Loves the Prophets, is written much like that, many, many years afterwards. And it was published as a book. And that was my first experience of Catholic life. And I thought to myself, my God, they're very quiet. They're so quiet. Jews are very talkative, tend to be, and very buoyant. Not, it's a stereotype, but it's somewhat true. And when I went up to Catholic worker, the amount of prayer that they had and the silence in that prayer and keeping silence, and the experience of working and living with the poor who lived on the streets. Oh, it's very difficult for me. And also another formative event in my life. Well, after I got my master's degree, coming back with my professor who had written on Dorothy Day, I went to New Orleans and worked among poor Black women. And this is Sister Lori Schaff. And she was a Catholic sister who, with a group of sisters, lived in a project with poor Black women. And I was asked to teach Black history. And I thought to myself, I had studied Black history, but I was white. And I wondered whether it was proper for me to teach Black women Black history being white. We have these questions again now in the United States about whites and Blacks. But Sister Lori said, you've studied Black history. These women do not know their history. Please teach. And so I sat with these women, mostly from sharecropping families, almost akin to slavery. They had just been freed from slavery, but were very poor. Many could not read, and they did not know their history. And we would sit around, and I would talk about Black history through formative events: Africa, slavery, the freedom from slavery, the civil rights movements, the struggles. And by teaching Black women their history, I learned in a deeper way my own Jewish history. Well, that's how I got to Maryhill. I don't know if many of you have heard of Maryhill, but Maryhill is a very prominent Catholic religious community, missionary community, of which there are Maryhill missionaries in the Philippines. And their headquarters is in New York. And one of the Marynolers, who was on the General Council, picked up a copy of my Year at the Catholic Worker book and wrote me a letter as I was studying for my PhD. And he told me about his experience in Bolivia as a missionary and reading my book in Saudi Arabia on the way to Yemen to create the first Maryhill dialogue unit with Muslims. This is back in the late 1970s. And I asked, I had never heard of Maryhill. And I asked the students around me, I was at a Jesuit university, and they said, oh yes, very important. I think you would like them. They brought me out to Maryhill, New York, and hired me that day to teach in their School of Theology. And there I am, as one priest used to call me, the young Dr. Marc Ellis, teaching at Maryhill in 1980. And this was another contact I had with the poor now around the world, because they had mission sites in Asia and Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. And I began to travel with Maryhill to their missions, which was very unusual for a Jew. I've been to more mission sites in the world than any Jew in history. It was quite an experience for me, seeing the old kind of mission, converting the pagans, and the new kind of mission, which emphasized liberation theology. And of course, I was more interested in the liberation theology that was often funded by Maryhill, came from Latin America, but spread to Africa and to Asia. These were people like in the Philippines, and had been oppressed by Christianity, somewhat like Jews had been oppressed by Christianity in Europe, but now had turned Christianity upside down as a form of liberation. And where did they go to get the liberating quality of Jesus? To the Jewish Bible. To free Jesus from the captivity of the church, as they put it, they went to the Exodus and the Jewish prophets. And there I entered into a tremendous, wonderful dialogue with liberation theologians from around the world. teaching at Maryhill from 1980 to 1995. And there's James Cone, and there's Rosemary Radford Ruther, and there's Gustavo Gutierrez. And this was a session that I had, a summer session that I directed in 1988, titled The Future of Liberation Theology. And there I met almost all of the great liberation theologians, and what an experience for me. And they were quite interested in meeting a Jew at a Catholic School of Theology who began to write a Jewish theology of liberation. And there I am in Jerusalem. This is 1987. I had been to Israel in 1973, but then returned in 1984. I had been invited to speak in Israel at a Protestant ecumenical place of education. And I said I would go there, but I would only go there if they helped me meet and travel with Palestinians. As a Jew, Palestinians were very foreign to me, being from the United States, of course, but also the Jewish community in general was very much against Palestinians because they felt that the Palestinians threatened Israel. And so I wanted to meet Palestinians like I had met Christians at the Catholic Worker and at my university and at Maryhill. And that was a way for me to ask, would Christianity always oppress Jews, or was there another kind of Christianity? And now I had to ask myself another question. What were we doing as Jews to Palestinians? Now, I wanted to meet Palestinians. And at that time, in 1984, very few Jews had met Palestinians in a peaceful way. There were a lot of Israeli soldiers, but those were not peaceful encounters. And so I went among Palestinians in 1984 and was so transformed by that experience that I said to myself, I have to find my voice. I have to speak about what we are doing to Palestinians. How do I speak? And that is a photo of me in Jerusalem where I launched my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. And it was a close encounter with a lot of emotion. The place, I was unknown and I thought no one would show up to hear me speak, but the place that I spoke at was packed. And it was very vibrant and a lot of rage and hope. And I spoke there directly about the need for Jews to confess our sins to the Palestinian people. Jews needed power after the Holocaust. Yes, I agreed. But we could not oppress another people. We needed to change and start again. And Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, Christian theology of liberation was about the poor and their need for empowerment, liberating the poor from their poverty. But Jews, after the Holocaust, had prospered, and we had become empowered. But now our power was not leading to liberation for us, certainly not for Palestinians. So I asked another question. Power and affluence can also enslave. How could we be truly free? That's the essence of Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. And I said then, and I say today, we as Jews will never be free until Palestinians are free in their own homeland. Well, there's Naim Atik, who came to hear me in 1987. He's on the left there. An Anglican priest, Palestinian, also an Israeli, because there were Palestinians who were thrown out of what became Israel, and there were some Palestinians left. And I've worked with him for many, many years. And he wrote a Palestinian theology of liberation. And we began to work together, Jews and Palestinians, in solidarity for a mutual liberation. But as you can see in my book, Practicing Exile, the road became very bumpy to speak for justice and to want justice and to act for justice all over the world, including in the Philippines and the Congo and Vietnam, wherever you come from. You're going to pay a cost. And the cost for Jews of conscience, as I call those of us who want Palestinians to be free, is exile. And of course, that's another theme in Jewish history, not only the prophetic, which is the essence of a Jewish theology of liberation, but the fact that when you exercise the prophetic, you will be thrown into exile, this time within Jewish empowerment. And then you have another form or another part of the journey, not only speaking for justice and acting for justice, but surviving that speech and that action. And practicing exile is developing a spirituality that helps to strengthen you in exile. Oh, and then that was well, you were there, my 68th birthday. What a birthday that was with all the surprises. And I learned a lot from it. Not only the accolades, which everybody likes, but themes that were in these messages that Professor Coy garnered, and how the prophetic fails, as I have failed, and as all of you will fail too. But that failure resonates within history and within others in history, at some point preparing the way for more life, most of which we will not see, and our children may not see, but that the path is prepared for the time in history when history opens for a new way. We don't know when that will be. It can be tomorrow, and it can be in 300 years. So practicing exile, practicing the prophetic, and getting a discipline, a daily discipline of practice, helps keep us on the path that keeps expanding throughout history and may one day become the path for all people in our world.
Okay, that's the last slide, Professor Ellis. Thank you so much. Let's pause for a few while I go back to our classroom. Okay, so that was, thank you so much, Professor Ellis, for that that narration, the narration of your life as a way of telling us how you found your voice. And that's also one of the themes of the reflections from the students about, you know, about finding your voice. Many of us, that would include me, have embarked on a path of, you know, trying to find our voice. And you said that you could actually, in this narration of yours, that finding your voice is a process of really dipping into your own history and then making sense of that history and your own destiny, or if you call it a destiny, or your own calling, based on the encounters, based on the encounters. And sometimes, and this is, we haven't really talked about this, as maybe you could talk about, you call them misadventures. Like one thing that, for example, you said something about you have, after college, you have been accepted to really prestigious graduate schools, but instead you went to the Catholic worker, and then that, of course, that brought you into a path. I mean, uh, it if you are success oriented, and if you think of yourself as really making a career, I think you would go to those prestigious schools, but instead you went to a Catholic worker. So yeah, so that's when I hear it and I hear this again, I am very struck with that. Is how how events are presented. You make a choice, and sometimes those choice would lead you into something, and something that's at the time is really doesn't make sense at all. It could even be a misadventure. But can you talk about that, about the, finding one's voice is dipping into your own history, and and really paying attention to the encounters with people, and sometimes the disparate events in your life make that could be a misadventure, could actually be a, later on would make sense. Can you, I don't know if that's
I think
yes.
the most important decision I made was I was accepted to Vanderbilt with a fellowship for my master's degree. And from there, I would have gone to Harvard and I would have had a great career. And I'm so glad I decided to go to the Catholic worker, not because it was easier. It turned out to be very difficult, and in some ways limited me in the academic world, because they want people from Vanderbilt and Harvard, but those are empty places. And I have met professors who were teaching there later when I was speaking, and I thought to myself, and I said to them, I'm so glad I didn't go and study with you. So we all make choices, and I'm not suggesting all make those choices, but downward mobility has its cost. It closes doors, but it also opens doors. And if I hadn't gone to the Catholic worker, I wouldn't have been a writer. I may have written, but a year at the Catholic worker, which were just my diaries, they weren't written as a book. I had no idea I'd ever get them published, became an opening for me, not only because Bob Dylan read it, and that's one of my great claims to fame, but because it opened the world of justice and the poor and commitment in a different way, and made me Jewish in a way that I needed to be in order to be faithful in history. And fidelity is about fidelity in faithfulness, is about fidelity in history. In my Jewish history, what does it mean to be Jewish? But also in a global sense, what does it mean to be human? And I've met people from all different faiths, Catholic and Protestant and Islamic and Hindu and Buddhist, all over the world, who have made similar decisions in their own way to be faithful in their history. And we are often partners in a way much more with each other than we are with parts of our own community. So that I have friends who are Catholic who I'm much closer to than many Jews, and Buddhists and Muslims, and them too, the same way. So I am so grateful that I made the decision that everybody must have thought, what in God's name is he doing? and to become a priest now. Let's think about it. What in God's name are you doing? That's to your class. And why are you teaching at Maryhill School of Theology? What in God's name are you doing there? And it's, on the one hand, it's a fulfillment. On another hand, it's downward mobility. And it's a search which is not going to be easy. And it hasn't been easy for me either. But when you close that door to elite academy, okay, it's not that the elite academy is only bad. But when I closed that door, another door opened, and there was Dorothy Day, who will one day be a Catholic saint. And I met her and lived around her and talked with her and others. And then to Maryhill and Gustavo Gutierrez, all of these great encounters that I've had are partly or mostly because I was on a search to be faithful too, and we were all searching. So there's a community of seekers. And by going to the Catholic Worker, I was brought into it in a very peculiar way for a Jew, and a way that opened me to the world and helped me to find my voice.
What's interesting about that is that usually when we say we want to be faithful to our own history, and usually that meant really being with our own kind, because and most of the time we thought that if you want to know more about ourselves, if we want to know more about our history, we go with people who are of our same kind. But what you're saying in here is how being with those who are different from you, Black women, Catholics, Muslims, Palestinians,
Yes.
and that deepened. And I think that is very important to emphasize. That I just thought about it because here, in Catholic calendar now, we are in a year that we called interfaith, the interfaith dialogue year. And that is part of the. Next year we will be commemorating the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines. And so there are, yearly themes that will help us reflect on that as we move to commemorating the 500th year. And this year is supposedly the interfaith, interreligious dialogue year. And now while hearing you say about your own history is that how actually encountering with those who are others, those who are different from you, who don't share your own culture, who don't share your own history, or you don't share your own religion or faith, are actually could bring you into something very deeper. It could lead you to some very important discoveries about yourself. And this is because some of them, this is in some of the papers, I think there's always a fear, a fear maybe among Catholics or even missionaries, that once you engage with others who are of this different faith, you are always, you are afraid or anxious that might lead you to be confused or, but in your case, that seems to be an encouragement to actually move forward to that direction.
Yeah, I'm always impressed by or depressed by religious people who are afraid of losing their faith. I find that interesting, especially Christians who say that the truth shall set you free. But what is truth? Maybe you find truth in encountering the other who isn't other. You think they're other. Palestinians are other to me as a Jew. Well, Yeah, maybe, but maybe not. Or Muslims, or yeah, I've always gone, I was introduced once, it surprised me, as a person who was a reconciler. I always thought of myself as a subversive, but I was introduced many years ago as a reconciler. I went among Germans after the Holocaust. That wasn't easy for me. I went among Palestinians. That wasn't easy for me. I've traveled all over the world, and people have all sorts of views toward Jews, some very romanticized and some very negative views, but I go. And I don't know, maybe it's partly my personality, but in traveling around the world, I found myself. And if you have a sense of self, you should want to engage others. And as in terms of the interfaith dialogue, I'm not interested in that at all. I'm interested in an interfaith solidarity. And when we get Christian, you know, we have these boxes. So we have a Christian go, and a Jew, and a Muslim. And you're in these boxes, and the box, and you know, you think of these people in boxes that are, you know, unstable, but we're very stable. So we're trying to be stable because I'm a Jew and you're a Catholic and you're a Muslim, and but it's you're almost you're almost falling down, and then you fall down, but you fall onto somebody else, and they're falling. It's like dominoes. So, yeah, the rigidity of these faith communities, Jewish and Catholic and Protestant and Muslim, and to me is not about religiosity. It's often about fear. If you have a faith, it should grow, it should expand. Parts of it should drop away. Other parts should come in. You don't know what in advance what it will be. But why be afraid of the other who you discover isn't other?
Yeah. Yes, and actually, when following that, you know, and this is how I actually look at Jewish, and especially when I read Jesus in the Gospels. You know, Jesus, and you actually brought it to my attention that Jews, like Jesus, are naturally boundary crossers.
Yes.
Yeah, so you know, Jesus has crossed a lot of boundaries. Yeah.
There are so many prohibitions in the Hebrew Bible against crossing boundaries because Jews are boundary crossers. You don't need prohibitions. You don't need a prohibition against boundary crossing if you're not always crossing boundaries. So, yeah, and the Catholic faith is too, and there are beautiful things about the Catholic faith, but one of the difficulties is a sense of Catholic. But Catholic encompasses so much. I mean, in the Philippines, when you celebrate the 500th year of the arrival of Christianity, you ought to be very careful. That was a brutal encounter. Philippines were conquered by the Christianity. This wasn't like Filipinos saying, please come, Spain. Spain, please come. You were conquered.
Yeah, just like other nations like Latin America
Totally.
and Africa. Yeah, we were conquered by colonization. Yeah.
Most Christians in the world have been conquered by Christianity. Now, and their traditions and their indigenous religions were killed off. Brutal. Brutal. So we don't want to celebrate the arrival of Christianity, in my view. We want to ask, or I think Christians ought to ask, what are we going to do with this religiosity, which is very dear to you, but also is part of violated you? And as a Jew, I have to think, I love being Jewish, but for Palestinians, Jews have devastated their culture. I have to think about that as a Jew. Now, Jews weren't conquered by Christianity, but we were oppressed for 1,500 years by Christianity. I mean, this was a brutal repression. Brutal. And now I have many friends who are Christian. But they have revised their sense of what it means to be a Christian. That's been very beautiful and helpful to me. We have to continually update and revise the signs of the times. This is what Vatican II is about, and how beautiful Vatican II was, but although a struggle, still today, even with Pope Francis, who's trying to continue in the Vatican II tradition, but the things that are said to him and done to him, and so terrible. It's a struggle within all of our religions to be free to pursue the truth as we find it within history, to be faithful.
To be faithful, yeah. Now, I'll have this last point, and then we'll open the floor for, interactions from the students. But the last point I want to make is, and this comes from the essays too, about Jesus and the indigenous prophetic. So you see, in Christianity, I think in Catholicism, we look at the prophetic we look at the prophetic as a way, as a participation in the mission of Jesus that we got through baptism. And so students say that, we basically are able to partake in that prophetic mission through Jesus. But for you, the prophetic is indigenous. So can you say more about that? About how, if Catholic thinks that their prophetic, their link to the prophetic is through baptism, which is a participation in Jesus' mission, but Jesus is Jewish, and so yeah. Can you say more about that?
I would say, in a broad sense, that I carry the same indigenous prophetic as Jesus did. Jesus wasn't a Christian. We know that. We always say, well, yeah, of course, we know that. But it actually is very important. Jesus was only a Jew. He wasn't a Christian. And what Christians have done with Jesus is something that Jesus might agree with or might not agree with. And much of it, I think Jesus would say, what are you doing in my name? So I identify with Jesus as a Jew. And of course, what you call the New Testament, or what I would call the Old Testament, I have an older testament, so I'll just call the New Testament the Old Testament. A lot of that was written, all of it was written after Jesus's death, and it was a lot of fighting among communities about what did Jesus mean. So I think it's best to think of Jesus only as a Jew and to ask yourself how you as Christians relate to the Jewish Jesus. And the prophetic may come through baptism ritually in the Catholic Church, which is fine. But Jesus didn't believe that he acted through an intermediary. Jesus acted on his own. Jesus didn't seem, at least from the Gospels, and we don't know really other than what the Gospels say, which were written many years after his death, didn't seem to ask permission. He seemed to go, and it's a fascinating life, even as related in the Gospels. He went out to others as a Jew. He supported being Jewish. He opposed certain kinds of Jewishness. He lived under occupation. He went out, he crossed all sorts of boundaries as a Jew. You know, most Christians, when I hear these sermons by priests, and some of them may be given soon by your students, even when they talk about Jesus as a Jew, he's this exceptional Jew and he's doing everything that no Jew would ever do. Forget it. Don't buy that. He did it because he was Jewish. This is very important. I do what I do because I'm a Jew. I'm not an exceptional Jew. Every Jew is called to draw near, to embrace, and to embody the prophetic. That's what it means to be Jewish. And in that way, Jesus was not an exemplary Jew. In many ways, I would consider Jesus an ordinary Jew.
That's something to really, really reflect on. Okay, so thank you, Professor Ellis. That's for that, for those responses. And now I would like to invite the students to, if they have, they have questions or clarification, or if they have some insights, especially those that they have raised in their essays, maybe they could, they could write something on the chat box now. Okay, I'm looking at the chat box now, and if you have questions or if you want to say something, just type that you would like to speak. Okay, if you have questions or maybe some of your thoughts, let's have maybe a few moments for some of your thoughts or reflections. You can write them now on the chat box. That also gives Professor Ellis a bit of a break after that presentation and discussion. Okay. If you want to say something, just write it on the chat box that you want to speak and you want to ask a question. Okay, so this one, there's a question here about Jesus. Okay, so let's continue our discussion on Jesus. And the question is, how can Jesus do his radical prophetic embodiment? Yeah.
Well, in the stories in the Gospels, again, we don't really know how much the Gospels comport with Jesus's life, but we have what they said about Jesus. So if we just take the Gospels about Jesus, well, you know what he did. He went out to others, he crossed boundaries, he helped those who were sick and ill, sat with those who were sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, all of this. He confronted Jewish authorities and Roman authorities when he thought they were being unjust. He was in the temple, according to the Gospels, and turning over the tables and said, what in God's name is going on here? It's so Jewish. And where's the justice of the world? And I have to speak to power. And these encounters with the Romans and with the Jewish authorities is quite interesting, because Jesus is saying, they're challenging him, who the heck do you think you are? And Jesus basically, in my sense, is saying, hey, I'm an ordinary Jew. Who are you? What are you talking about? What are you doing? And what are you accusing me of? Helping people and being with people and eating with people. And I love this sense that one of the Catholic theologians wrote about Jesus, John Dominic Crossan, as embodying the brokerless kingdom of God. So I'm very taken with some. And of course, the Passion, Jesus suffered for his beliefs and for embodying the prophetic. If you want to look at somebody who embodied the prophetic, well, Jesus is right up there with the prophets. He's very much in line with Isaiah and Hosea and Jeremiah, on the run, crossing boundaries. Elijah, the ravens who bring, Elijah food. Ezekiel, who is forced to go to his people and eat the text that tastes sweet like honey, although it's his condemnation. And so I would see Jesus as, and some Christians see it this way, others don't, but as in the prophetic line. There's no other way to understand him, in my view. And he just seems to embody it. And I think Jews rail against the prophetic too, because who can live with the prophetic? But we're always shadowed by it. We're always haunted by it. The most natural state for Jews, in my view, is to draw near, to embrace, and to embody the prophetic. That's our indigenous. That was Jesus's indigenous. He didn't have a foreign faith. He didn't have a faith that was forced upon him. That was his indigenous faith. It was Jewish. And many Catholics that I know and appreciate would very much say, yeah, I see that today, after this long history.
Yeah.
So I think the gospel stories show you it's not a ritual. It becomes a ritual later. You ritualize what Jesus did naturally as a Jew.
Yeah. So here's a follow-up question. And this is in reaction to what you said about Jesus acted on his own. There was no intermediary. And the question is, how could this be? And how come his disciples looked at him as a mediator? And it couldn't be just a romanticization from the disciples.
Well, first of all, we don't know exactly how the apostles looked at him, but through the Gospels, I would say we gather around the doomed prophet. The prophetic community gathers around the doomed prophet. Now, Jesus was, I'm saying, an ordinary Jew, but also he was extraordinary, right? The prophets are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. And for some reason, and we see this in history since then too, you have people within histories who emerge, who embody a people's history, who embody the prophetic. It's not that they are only exceptional, but they embody the prophetic in an exceptional way, and it's recognized by others. You know when you've encountered somebody who's different, very much like all of us, of course, 95% is the same, but that 5% that's different. Jesus did everything that everybody does, but there was something about him. Isaiah and Jeremiah, they were all like that. So the prophet is one that arrives, and we witness the prophet. And we gather around the prophet because the prophet is doomed. And Jesus is a great example of it, not the only from my perspective, but an exemplar of this tradition. And so the apostles recognize, of course, they also fought it, because who wants to gather around a doomed prophet? Because the apostles are saying, what the heck is going to happen to us? So, there's a difference between the prophet and the prophetic community. The apostles are part of the prophetic community gathering around the doomed prophet. And you say, well, how did Jesus get it? And there are many, many different responses. And I would say he got it because he got it. We don't know how the prophets get it, but he had it. And that's because he came from a tradition whose indigenous is the prophetic. And it's the same tradition I come from.
And maybe the other parts of the gospel, especially, you know, these stories about his birth, his childhood, you know, maybe these
they're
are
always,
also ways of trying to make sense of where did he get it? Asking that question.
it's like writing a biography of a prophetic figure. You think, well, you have the prophet, and then you think, well, how did that happen? So you try to figure it out, which is also quite human and quite interesting. And in the end of the book, you know, I love reading biographies, but they have to be 600, 700, 800 pages. In the end of the book, you close the book and you just say, wow. You know, you've been reading and reading hundreds of thousands of words about a life, and at the end of it, the basic thing, you close the book and you say, that's an amazing life. We can't get the prophetic, the prophet is a mystery. Why that person like Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr. or people in the Philippines. Yeah. The person Aquino who came back to the Philippines and was assassinated. I remember watching that on TV. I didn't even know where the Philippines was then. I was so ignorant, but I thought, why did he go back? Didn't he know what would happen? What was in him where he said, you know what? This is it. I'm going. So it's a mystery. I say the prophet comes from somewhere else, which is also here.
Yeah. But speaking of that, yeah, and this is also in the questions, you know, we elevate the prophetic, we exalt it, we value it. And yet there are also in our tradition a way, and this maybe in the Gospels, you know, the Jews that handed him over to the Roman authorities. In many those who have embodied the prophetic, they are put up there, but at the same time, they are also you know, they're deemed troublemakers. They see them as so there's a, you know, and it's that ambivalence about the prophetic, about, or we valorize it, we glorify it, but at the same time we also are afraid of it, and we don't want it in a way.
Well, I'll tell you a story. In the Philippines, I go to visit students when I was in teaching there. And if you recall, there was a place that we went to where the leader of the congregation referred to me as that Jew in a very negative way. He had Jew all sized up with Jesus, but he didn't want to meet a Jew today. Jews are disturbing, but aren't Christians called to be disturbing? Wasn't Jesus disturbing? So, yeah, of course. If you're going to be, you know, in the Gospels, now we don't know what happened, but in the Gospels it says that the Jews handed Jesus over. Well, every congregation, every religious authority is going to hand over the prophets. Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. They're also going to venerate them. Usually they venerate them after they hand them over.
That is true.
Yeah. That is true. So we're ambivalent about the prophetic and the prophets because it calls us to a deeper sense. So we try to put it on Jesus or on Moses or Isaiah or Jeremiah, they did it. Well, who are they? They're also us. We're called to do it. So we often put it over and say, we're going to venerate this person and that, so we don't have to do it. Now that person who's being venerated is probably looking at you who are venerating him and saying, hey, stop it. Stop, stop, stop. Venerating me, do something. And I often think in these religious, especially Catholic, and again, many Catholic friends, and I've learned so much from Catholics, and great Catholic fan, but I think, when you're venerating, when as seminarians are venerating Jesus for hours, I imagine when I'm sitting there with people, Jesus saying, hey, look, guys, stop venerating me, do something.
Yeah, and that's why I think many students have, this from your last conversations. This has helped a number of students. And one of the things that they remembered from their first conversation was when you said that when you read the words of the prophet, when you hear the voice of the prophets, that's also your own. And I think owning that voice of the prophets as your own is a great way to actually uh, uh, reflect on the prophetic. Okay,
If
just
it
two more.
if it wasn't our voice, how would we recognize it?
Oh, that's true. Yeah. So two more, Professor Ellis, before we wrap up. One is from Gustavo, but I think maybe Gustavo could ask the question himself. Gustavo, could you unmute?
Yes. So my question is, because in your book, Dr. Ellis, I Am Who Loves the Prophets, you say that you could not make it without God in exile. So I was just wondering what that means. So does that mean that God functions as a kind of comforter to the prophet when he is in exile? Because I know that the prophet, uh, and most especially you in your thought, the prophet is always struggling with the God who is and the God who isn't, right? And you'll say that a lot. But at the same time, God seems not to be present, not to be here, but on one hand, but on the other hand, the prophet cannot make it without God either. So, uh, what does that mean actually? Does that mean that?
That's a good question, Gustavo. Thank you for asking me a question that I can't answer. But here's the deal. This is what happened. I was asked to give a lecture with others to honor Edward Said, the great Palestinian, who was Christian, by the way, although totally secular, and he hated religion. He was Anglican by birth, Palestinian, great man, whom I knew. And he wrote about exile, and he started out by saying, I don't want to talk about God. I'm talking about being exiled from Palestine. The religious stuff is not interesting to me. And I was going deeper and deeper into exile because of my stance on Palestinians. So I was asked to lecture on his understanding of exile. So I said to myself, and I was sitting down each morning and I said to myself, I've got to ask God about my exile. I kept asking God, but I didn't get any answer. So I started asking myself. And I just came to the conclusion, without being a systematic theologian and without being able to give this great explanation about God, because as you know, I do not do that, that I couldn't make it without God. But I'm not going to be very helpful on the question of God, except to say, God is very present to me in the questions I ask. And Yeah. So for instance, today the prophets can't say, I'm a prophet, I've been called by God. People are going to say, what? What are you talking about? You know, you're going to tell me that I have to do something because you've been called by God? You know, people are, at least in the West, I don't know about the Philippines, but in Europe and the United States, people are going to say, check him into a mental hospital. He's been talking to God. That doesn't mean that God is absent. It's just that you can't make that claim now. So the question of God is a very private question, I think, very internal, what I call prophetic interiors. And when I write in the prophetic interiors in my previous book that you've read, Finding Our Voice, again, yeah, so I'm not going to, Gustavo, I can't help you in the way that your seminary professors can help you with a kind of a creedal affirmation. All I can tell you is that I feel very much in dialogue with a present, absent God. And I would love to chat with God and with Jesus, by the way, have a long discussion about many things. And if you come to the United States, we'll go to the Chapel of Love. And I've always thought, wouldn't it be nice if God visited me in the chapel, or Jesus, and we sat down and had a chat? Now you think, well, that's blasphemous. But if you look at the Hebrew Bible, Moses is basically having a picnic with God on Mount Sinai. They're hanging out. They're having quite a discussion. And if you remember in the Hebrew Bible, God admonishes Moses, God talks to Moses, and often Moses talks back. So for instance, God says, this is one of my favorites, God says, that's it, I'm done with them. They are the most rebellious, stiff-necked people, I'm done with them. You come with me. And Moses said, I'm not going with you. I'm with them. I understand what you're saying. Moses says, I get your point, but I'm with them. And God thinks about it in the Hebrew Bible and says, all right, okay, we'll go together. So the idea of speaking with God is very Jewish, and arguing with God. Very, very Jewish. And it leaves in the Christian tradition, you rarely find it. But I find among Christians that there's a lot of discussion with God and arguing with God, but not publicly. You can't admit that you're arguing with God. That's somehow losing your faith. As a Jew, arguing with God is part of God's presence and conversation with God, and sometimes being admonished by God. So I see God as, in a sense, I don't want to say a partner, but a conversation partner who accompanies me and others, but I'm just talking for myself. And we have some very interesting chats. And I also have my own ability to say, you know what? You can have that point of view, but I'm not going there. And God can say, oh, okay, where do you think you're going to go without me? And I could say, well, you know, I'm walking. So the idea here, very Jewish, is that we have our own will too. It's not that I'm above God, but that God can't just say, you know, I have my own ability to think. And of course, with God being AWOL so much of the time, like in the Philippines or in Brazil, you think, well, where the heck is God? You know, these people are being gunned down, and you know, in the Amazon. And I don't have to tell you about what's happening in Brazil, but just reading and having friends from Brazil, I mean, you have to ask, where's God? Well, where was God in the Philippines when Christianity came? You might say, well, Christianity brought God. No, I'm not going there. No, no. So, conversation with God, interrogating God, being interrogated by God, But as a partner, yeah, a stronger partner, I agree. But I have my own will, and I can also say to God and suffer punishment for it. That's it. I'm not going there. And I could be wrong. But according to the Hebrew Bible, God can sometimes say, you know what, Mark, you are quite a character, but I hear you. I'm going to think about it. Now, I know people might think this is a little bit too blasphemous, but here's the deal too about Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. When I think of Jesus, I think of him as part of my tribe. So I can have discussions with Jesus too. Now, some Jews might say, well, forget about that. Don't do that. But that's part of history. But yeah, so.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah, I think it's a good way to think about God as a conversation partner, one who speaks and sometimes listens, the one who argues. I actually love the story that you said about Moses arguing with God, and just now I am reading it's an article by Terence Frantheim. It's about agency in the Exodus. And it talks about, God has this plan on how to liberate the Jews from the Hebrew slaves from Egypt. And then Moses just said, no, I'm not doing it. And so God has to resort to plan B. Okay, here's Aaron. So God has all of this negotiation going on. And you can see that, God listens. And
This
God,
is where Jewish humor comes from. The Bible is filled with Jewish humor, including saying, God, hey, step back for a second. I exist too. We're here, and we have a contract with you, and you're not doing so well. You're not really fulfilling your obligations. So when you don't fulfill your obligations, like protecting us and freeing us and being with us and comforting us, but if you're not going to fulfill, why do we have to fulfill our part of the contract?
yeah.
So there's a bargaining from the beginning, and it's an interesting bargaining, and I think God appreciates that bargaining. I think God thinks, wow, I like that. It's like children who say something to the parents and say, hey, Dad, like my kids have, hey, Dad, back off. We have our own life too.
Yeah, it's a chutzpah, right?
Yeah,
Very
yeah,
Jewish
they're
chutzpah.
Jewish. Yeah. By the way, Jesus had it. Look at Jesus. He's doing everything he's not supposed to do, and he doesn't seem to have a care in the world. He doesn't have a big argument. He just does it, and he seems to enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
He seems to enjoy tweaking authority. Jesus seems, there's not a lot of laughter in the Gospels, but it seems to me that as a Jew, he'd be having a pretty good time and saying, yeah, you told me I can't sit with these people. Here I am. I'm sitting with them. How about that? What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
I like that attitude. Very Jewish.
Okay. Anyway, I actually this is just a wild idea. Maybe in one of the in one of the discussions on the Global Prophetic Voice seminar, I would include Jewish humor and playfulness. I think that would be because they always think of the prophet as so serious and grim and determined, but actually there's a lot of humor. And if you read the Bible from a Jewish, with a Jewish sensitivity, there's actually a lot of humor and playfulness.
Sarah getting pregnant well after the time that she could, and she's laughing her head off. She thinks it's the funniest thing that ever happened, that she's going to have a baby. And she does.
Yeah. Yes. So I think that's a good way to wrap up this discussion. So there are there are quite a number of other questions, but basically, DJ says, thank you so much for this conversation. and she especially about the interreligious dialogue, which is very much needed. Your comments on interreligious and interfaith solidarity is very helpful. And then Nguyen Wang Vong also said something about the silence of the prophet. We talk about voice, but also the silence. That is also a way for the prophet, especially, you know, with the injustice. Sometimes the response is really silence. And then Reverend Era says, thank you very much. She's enjoying our conversation about Jesus. And then Muchili also, but maybe this one we could talk about this next time, about Holocaust theology. I think that's a whole semester. But he's very interested about the Holocaust theology, about the Holocaust, and he wants to know more, and the role of God, and all of, because I think that's very important for him in the debate regarding the role of God in the world. As you said, you know, where is God in the Amazon destruction, in the killings, in the you know, so much poverty in the world? What is God's role? And I think the Holocaust theologians very much presented a very strong argument about, you know, how do we look at history? If God is the God of history, then where is God in our history? Yeah, so those are so far the comments, but I think we're running out of time. In fact, so thank you so much, Professor Ellis, and this is I enjoyed this conversation. I hope the students also find this very enjoyable, very enlightening, enriching, and this is you know, this is a very good experience of interfaith conversation.
Solidarity.
We learned so much from you. So last word, Professor Ellis.
Well, so much for inviting me back. I'm not always invited back, so I'm very taken with being invited back. And thank you to the students for listening. And I hope they understand that I'm very much respecting their faith, but I'm also questioning aspects of our joint faith. You know, discussion about God and about Jesus. And so I'm very glad to have been here, and I thank you very much for welcoming me back.
It's our pleasure, our privilege and honor to have you speak with us again. And you know, this is really I think very important, especially in our discussion of your thoughts on the prophetic. So thank you so much in behalf of the class. Thank you so much, Professor Ellis, for giving us your time and sharing so much, sharing better for your generosity. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for back.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so
yes, we really learned.
Students can unmute, and then you can say your thank you to Professor Ellis.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Professors.
Okay, bye.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Thank you, Coy. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Reverend Era, thank you.
Hi, Eric.
Hello, Prof. Thank you. I hear so much. Very thought-provoking.
Okay, thank you. Good seeing you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the class.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.